You know, it's a fascinating thing. People tend to think that communication is all about words, but most of the time it isn't. It's about tone, timing, behavior, attention, what we prioritize, and how we shift. And women, in particular, are remarkably attuned to these subtle shifts in energy. This isn't just some vague idea about intuition. It's rooted in something very real. For generations, women have had to be highly sensitive to the emotional climate around them. There was a survival component to it, a way of maintaining safety and connection in complex social dynamics. That kind of emotional acuity doesn't just disappear, it becomes embedded in how a woman perceives the world, especially in her relationships. Now, what does that mean in practice? It means that if you, as a man, begin to withdraw, if your interest starts to fade, even before you've said a single word about it, she'll probably notice. Before you know you've checked out, she's already feeling it. Maybe you stop responding as quickly, or your compliments sound more mechanical. Maybe your physical touch becomes less intentional. You think you're doing a good job hiding it, masking your fading engagement under the routines of daily life, but she sees it. Not necessarily consciously at first, but something in her starts to tighten up. A little alarm bell goes off, something's changed, and that's when everything starts shifting beneath the surface. It might look like nothing from the outside, just a quiet evening, a brief pause, an unusually short response to a message. But inside, the wheels are turning. She's trying to make sense of something she feels but hasn't yet confirmed. And this is important, because that initial sensing phase is often where a lot of damage can be done without anyone realizing it. You see, when a woman senses that your attention is no longer present, when your presence starts to feel more like absence, what's actually happening is a breakdown of trust, not necessarily trust in you, specifically, but in the safety of the connection itself. If she's been investing her emotions, her time, her affection, then your energy, or lack of it, becomes the ground she's standing on. And if it starts crumbling, she feels it in a very visceral way. That's why, when your interest begins to drift, she doesn't always react with confrontation. Sometimes the first response is internal, it's subtle, she watches, she notices the change in how you look at her, the shift in how you touch her, the difference in how you listen, or don't. It's not always about needing reassurance or craving validation. Often it's about clarity, because for a woman who is emotionally invested, the ambiguity of fading interest is worse than rejection. At least rejection is honest, ambiguity is corrosive, it's confusing. It makes her question herself, which is destabilizing, and so her nervous system begins responding to that uncertainty, often before her mind has caught up. She starts preparing for impact. This is why your presence matters. Not just your physical presence, your psychological presence. Are you there? Are you engaged? Are you interested in her, or just going through the motions? Because if you're not present, she's not going to feel safe. And when that safety disappears, her instincts kick in. So when a woman senses that you've lost interest, it's not a trivial thing. It triggers something deep, not just disappointment, but a fundamental recalibration of how she sees you, and perhaps how she sees herself in relation to you. Once that initial shift is felt, once a woman senses that something's changed in the dynamic, it doesn't just pass through her unnoticed. It sits with her, it brews, and often the very first response she has isn't anger or withdrawal or confrontation. No, the first thing that tends to rise is confusion, and that confusion, if left unchecked, almost always turns inward. She starts asking herself, did I do something wrong? Did I change? Is he upset with me and just not saying it? Now, that's a very important moment, because it speaks to how deeply relational and reflective many women are. She's not always rushing to blame you, not initially. What she's doing is scanning the environment, scanning herself, trying to locate the source of the shift. And she doesn't always do that by analyzing the facts. She does it by checking her own emotional signals. She might replay recent conversations, examine your tone, the way you touched her last night, how present or distracted you seemed during dinner. And if she can't make sense of it, if there's no obvious cause, the uncertainty begins to grow roots. She might start thinking it's her fault, even if it isn't. This is a quiet kind of chaos, and that's what makes it so powerful, and potentially damaging. Because now, not only is there a gap opening up between the two of you, but she's also beginning to carry the emotional burden of trying to close it without any clear map. She's trying to reconnect dots that may not be reconnectable. She might begin modifying her own behavior, softening her voice, acting extra considerate, offering affection more deliberately, not because she's needy, but because she's trying to reignite the warmth she used to feel coming from you. She's responding to a perceived disconnection by overcompensating, hoping that whatever she's sensing is just a misread, a misunderstanding, something fixable, but that's where things become dangerous. Because if you've truly lost interest and haven't communicated it, or worse, if you're emotionally retreating without being honest, then you've placed her in a kind of emotional labyrinth. She's walking through it blindfolded, trying to decode a message you haven't spoken. And the longer she stays in that space, the more she risks losing trust in her own intuition. That's the irony. The more effort she puts into understanding what happened, the more she begins to question whether she can actually trust how she feels. And that undermines her, not just in the relationship, but in herself. So what you often get right there in that early stage is a woman who's still trying, still leaning in, still offering softness, kindness, patience. Not because she's weak, quite the opposite. It's because she values connection, and because she still believes in the possibility that something real is still there, even if it's dimmed. But that effort doesn't come without cost. It requires emotional labor, and if it goes unreciprocated, if you stay emotionally absent while she's there carrying the weight of reconnection, you begin to fracture something much more serious than attraction or affection. You fracture trust, and so when a woman starts to feel you pulling away, her first instinct might not be to match your distance. It might be to close the space to try. But if she's doing all the emotional work while you silently check out, what you're teaching her, whether you mean to or not, is that her vulnerability is unsafe. At a certain point, when a woman has sensed the shift and questioned herself enough, when she's extended emotional effort without reciprocation, something else begins to emerge. She starts to realize that the connection she's trying to maintain might not be mutual anymore. That realization doesn't always come in a grand moment of clarity. Sometimes it's subtle. A quiet decision made over several days, after too many moments of feeling alone in the presence of someone she used to feel deeply connected to. And that's when something significant happens. She begins to pull back. Now, this pulling back, this withdrawal, it's not necessarily about playing games or punishing the man. It's not even always about anger. It's about self-preservation. It's a natural psychological response to emotional danger, because if you offer vulnerability, affection, presence, and those things are met with coldness or indifference, you learn quickly that continuing to reach out might only lead to more pain. So she starts to build a kind of internal boundary, a wall, not to shut you out, but to protect herself from further disappointment. And let's be clear, this is not weakness, it's strength. It's a boundary being drawn in real time. It's a woman recognizing that she has to reclaim her emotional space, because it's no longer safe to leave it in your hands. And so, you might notice she becomes quieter, less expressive. She doesn't initiate conversations the way she used to. She's no longer seeking physical affection or asking how your day went. That's not her being cold, it's her not wanting to keep extending warmth into a space that no longer returns it. This is the kind of response that often confuses men. She just changed, they'll say. She used to be so affectionate, now she's distant. But they don't realize that her change was in response to theirs. It's reflective, it's reactive. She didn't pull back out of nowhere. She pulled back because the emotional environment told her it was necessary, and once that shift begins, once she starts pulling back, it's very hard to reverse, Because what's been broken isn't just connection, it's safety. What's even more complex is that she might not communicate this withdrawal overtly. She might not say, "I'm pulling back because you've been distant." Instead, she just moves differently. She guards her words. She conserves her energy. She stops chasing a presence that no longer shows up for her. This isn't manipulation. It's a recalibration of emotional investment. And if you're not attuned to it, you might think she's overreacting or being dramatic. But what she's actually doing is something very rational. She's adjusting her behavior to reflect what she's receiving. This kind of emotional protection is necessary because when love is offered but not returned, it hurts. And when that hurt becomes a pattern, it becomes unsustainable. So rather than let herself keep pouring into an empty vessel, she stops, she contains, she redirects, and that can look cold, even ruthless, to someone who's used to being the recipient of her warmth. But what you're seeing is not a sudden change. It's the final result of a long emotional process, one you may have overlooked or dismissed while it was unfolding. And here's where it gets real. Once she reaches this point, it often means something fundamental has shifted in how she sees you. Not necessarily with resentment, but with clarity, and clarity changes everything. Because once a woman decides to protect her peace more than she wants to preserve your comfort, she doesn't chase anymore. Once a woman has begun to pull back, once she's stepped out of that emotionally exposed space where she used to give freely, something interesting often follows. She starts to test, not in some manipulative, calculated sense, but in a very instinctive human one. Because when you don't feel safe, and when you can't quite tell if you've been emotionally abandoned or simply misreading the situation, you start looking for clues. You probe the structure for weakness. You want to know, asterisk, is this still real, or am I alone here? Asterisk, and so the woman might start acting a little differently, not vindictively, not aggressively, but more reserved, more strategic, more watchful. She might delay her responses, she might cancel plans, she might show up in the same space but seem a little less emotionally available, a little cooler, a little sharper around the edges. It's not that she's trying to hurt you, it's that she's gathering data. She's watching how you respond to her shift in energy, the same way she felt yours shift earlier, because she wants to know if you even notice, if you care, if your attention returns now that it's no longer being taken for granted. These little behavioral tests aren't about control. They're about information. She wants to know what she means to you now, given that something has changed, and often these tests aren't planned, they're reactive. They come from a place of emotional disruption. She's trying to confirm or disprove a gut feeling. Is she being paranoid, or is your disinterest real? Is she imagining it, or has your affection actually faded? And the only way to answer that question, in the absence of honest conversation, is to push a little, step back a little, see what happens when she's no longer the one holding up the connection. It's a feedback loop. She senses distance, she creates distance, and she watches to see if you close the gap, and your response in those moments tells her more than your words ever could. If you don't notice, or worse, if you seem relieved by her emotional retreat, then she has her answer. That's when she starts to accept the reality she was hoping wasn't true, that you've already left, maybe not physically, but emotionally. But if you react with curiosity, with presence, with a desire to understand, then she knows there's still something there. Something worth exploring, maybe even salvaging, because the truth is, most women don't want to pull back. They don't want to test or question. They want to trust the connection. But when the behavior stops aligning with the bond they once felt, testing becomes a survival response, a way of anchoring themselves in emotional reality. You have to understand, for many women, emotional disconnection doesn't just feel like rejection. It feels like a kind of disappearance, like you've become someone else. And so, these small tests, these seemingly minor adjustments in tone, in pace, in presence, they're how she checks if the man she once knew is still in there. She's not trying to break you down, she's trying to find you. But if you're already gone, if you've already checked out and you're just coasting on routine or obligation, then she'll stop looking. So when a woman starts acting differently, when she seems harder to read, less eager, less emotionally available, it's not the beginning of her losing interest. It's the end of her trying to preserve yours. At some point, after the distance has been felt, after the confusion and the subtle tests have run their course, a woman reaches a fork in the road. It's the moment where she stops waiting for your energy to return. And what happens next, how she chooses to respond, says less about you and more about her sense of self, because a woman's ultimate response to your fading interest isn't just emotional. It's reflective of her identity, her self, worth, and what she believes she deserves. If she's anchored in a strong sense of self, if she values her emotional world and understands her own worth, then your disinterest becomes a mirror, not a wound. She doesn't chase, she doesn't beg, she doesn't try to become smaller just to fit back into a space you've clearly begun vacating. Instead, she lets go, not out of bitterness, but out of alignment. She realizes that staying in a dynamic where she's no longer fully seen or valued costs more than it gives, and that clarity, when it hits, is like a switch flipping. Once it's on, it doesn't go off again. Now, that doesn't mean she never cared. It doesn't mean she didn't want it to work. It means that she finally respects herself enough to stop handing out intimacy to someone who treats it like background noise. And if she's emotionally mature, she might not even get angry. She might simply disappear, quietly, fully, no dramatic exit, just presence removed. That's often the most powerful thing a woman can do when she realizes she's no longer emotionally safe. Reclaim her presence. But it's not always that clean. Some women haven't built that level of self-trust yet. Some are still learning how to separate their worth from the validation they seek in relationships. And when they sense someone pulling away, they don't retreat. They grasp, they try harder, they overextend themselves, not because they're weak, but because they're afraid. Afraid that if they lose this connection, it'll mean something's wrong with them, that they weren't enough, that they failed. And this is the tragedy, because that effort, that chasing, that emotional bargaining, it rarely brings someone back. All it does is drain the woman even more. She bends, she stretches, she reshapes herself in hopes of reigniting what was once freely given. And in the process, she loses parts of herself. Her laughter becomes quieter, her confidence dulls, her world shrinks to the size of someone else's indifference, and that's not love, that's erosion. So the difference in how a woman responds to your loss of interest, whether she walks or waits, comes down to how much of her identity is tied to the relationship. If she sees it as an addition to her life, not the source of her value, she'll step away. But if she's still learning to draw that line, she may stay too long, hoping that love can be willed into being again through sheer effort. And here's the part that's often overlooked. Both responses are valid. They both speak to where the woman is in her journey. One reflects resolution, the other reveals a lesson still unfolding. But in both cases, what's revealed is the cost of emotional ambiguity. Because when a woman is forced to guess where she stands, she either grows distant or loses herself trying to stay close. So when she finally responds, when she either walks away or clings too tightly, it's never random. It's a reflection of how much she's had to carry in the silence. And then there's the final stage. The place most men don't expect to arrive at until it's too late. It's the moment where she stops feeling much of anything. Not out of hatred, not out of pain, but because the emotional engine that once drove her connection to you has finally gone quiet. This isn't about anger anymore. It's not about trying to fix or explain or even test. It's about detachment, and detachment is powerful because it's not a reaction, it's a conclusion. See, by the time she gets to this point, she's already done the emotional math. She's already reviewed the history, questioned herself, offered space, extended grace, and tried to reawaken something that felt like it was dying. And when all of that effort still led to silence or coldness or indifference, she began to understand the cost of staying emotionally invested in a one-sided connection. So she starts to withdraw not just from you, but from the version of herself that needed your attention to feel whole. It's not always dramatic. Often it's subtle, almost invisible, but it's real. She'll still be polite, maybe even kind. She may laugh at your jokes, ask about your day, and go through the rhythms of conversation. But the undercurrent is gone. The emotional texture, the warmth, the longing, they've been replaced with something quieter, something still. You're not in a fight anymore because she's no longer playing the game. What you're hearing is the sound of the door closing, even if she hasn't said the words yet. And that's the moment so many men misread. They think she's finally calmed down, that the storm has passed, and maybe things are returning to normal. But what's actually happened is far more serious. She's detached. She's stopped needing your validation, your closeness, your emotional availability, because she's accepted, sometimes painfully, that those things aren't coming. And when someone accepts that, they stop trying to pull it from you. They find it elsewhere, or they find it within themselves. That's why the silence after the storm isn't peace, it's distance. Real, irreversible distance. She's not acting distant to provoke a reaction. She's distant because there's no reaction left to provoke. And this can be incredibly hard to recognize, especially if you've grown accustomed to her emotional presence. Because now, she's not giving you her energy. Not in love, not in frustration, not in effort, and the absence of that energy can feel like being ghosted in plain sight. She's still there, but not asterisk with asterisk you. And what's even more humbling is realizing that the moment of detachment doesn't come from a single event. It's not because of one fight, one mistake, one wrong word. It comes from accumulation. It's what happens when she carried too much, questioned too often, hoped too long. Emotional detachment is the natural conclusion to prolonged emotional starvation. At this point, you can apologize, you can explain, you can even promise to change, but you'll notice that it doesn't land the same way it used to. That's because she's already left, even if her body hasn't. Her mind, her heart, they're occupied elsewhere now, probably in a place that feels safer, quieter, more honest. And once a woman has reached that state, she's not waiting for you to return. She's not hoping you'll fix it. She's not measuring your words anymore. She's measuring her exit. Not necessarily to hurt you, but to save herself. Because at some point, love isn't enough to keep her in a place that asks her to abandon her own emotional needs.